This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time now for the very last installment of the history of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers from 1910. This is the epilogue. Law brushed aside. Trust magnates were superior to law, and could well afford to contemplate it with disdain. More antitrust legislation enacted by Congress in years subsequent to 1890 did not accordingly retard the organization of a host of industrial trusts. Between 1894 and 1901, hundreds were formed with an aggregate of capital of $4 billion. And even if, prompted by great public agitation, the government did make a brave show of bringing criminal proceedings, the highest court found a way of, quote-unquote, interpreting. In particular, in a suit against the Standard Oil Company, the Supreme Court of the United States applied what it termed the, quote, rule of reason, unquote. To prove a trust criminal, the ruling held, it was necessary to prove it, quote-unquote, undue or, quote-unquote, unreasonable. As for the civil aspect, the consequences of decisions caused some rearrangement of trust construction, but neither impaired power or revenues. A way was easily found of continuing with the components as legally distinct, but all remaining under the ownership of the same men or interests. Before the decreed dissolution of the Standard Oil Company in 1911, it had yielded gigantic total sums in dividends. How did dissolution and the resolving of one company into a group of companies affect the revenues? From the dissolution to the end of 1927, according to compilations made by Dow Jones and Company, leading stock market statisticians, the dividend distributions of the group of Standard Oil companies totaled $3,297,140,707. Of this sum, $1,909,006,462 was in cash, and $1,388,079,245 in stock dividends. I have trouble even reading numbers that large. Wow. And this was in 1910. At its maximum, the fortune of John D. Rockefeller, the principal of the Rockefeller brothers, perhaps exceeded $1 billion. Oh man, where's the Jubilee year? Where is the Jubilee year? After devoting all of his energetic years to acquisition, he had personally retired from business. Storms of denunciation had been leveled at him. His corporation and his methods had been an endless target of attack. He had surmounted proddings which would have made a nervous wreck of many men. His endurance was such as to sustain a vitality which, with the most careful ministrations, prolonged his life decade after decade until now he is approaching the centenarian age. A change of technique. Before about the year 1910, money magnates, battling with much hostile opinion, believed in the corrupt use of money to overcome it. To procure necessary legislation, to strangle inimical legislative proposals, and to circumvent such laws as were enacted, indirection based upon the distribution of masses of money was depended upon. Lobbies flush with funds were maintained at legislative centers. Their operations provoked such scandals and finally became so offensive that laws were passed in an attempt to regulate them. The subsidizing of a portion of the newspaper press and magazines was a regular procedure. There now came a notable change of technique on the part of a number of corporations. Jerome D. Green, a Rockefeller spokesman, thus put the case in his testimony before the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations on February 2nd, 1915, quote, "But as to publicity, there are two meanings to that word, Mr. Chairman. The word has been given quite a black eye, chiefly because of a discredited method of publicity. I am referring now to the method of ingratiating the public and winning over the support of newspapers, either through the publication of advertisements, which may be thought to bring pressure on the expression of editorial opinion, or by the deliberate buying up of editorial and news space, if that's possible. Suspicion that that has been done has undoubtedly existed in the United States. Now, that method of publicity has been entirely discredited, and its place has been taken in the enlightened usage, I think, of most of our corporations by a method of frankly stating the facts from an interested point of view of the corporations," unquote. Green added that, quote, "The chief exponent of that honest, candid, and fair method of publicity is Mr. Ivy L. Lee," unquote. Quote, "Public Relations Counsel," unquote. The commission examined Ivy Lee at great length, and much testimony was brought out as to his varied activities and the retainers from corporations which he drew. The fact emerged that he was one of the most industrious of the high-salaried propagandists invested with the impressive appellation of, quote, "Public Relations Counsel," unquote. This term seemed to carry the implication that the corporations were fully taking the public into their confidence and appealing to its goodwill and fair judgment. But the Commission's final report ridiculed the claim that certain quote-unquote literature, thus distributed by a central bureau, was fair publicity. It was entirely partial, and some of it the Commission denounced as not only untrue and misleading, but contained, in one noteworthy instance involving a strike in Colorado, a positively malicious and libelous assertion regarding labor unions. More facts as to Lee's activities came out in a hearing before a U.S. Senate subcommittee on naval affairs in 1929 and 1930. According to the testimony of William B. Shearer, a paid propagandist for warship-building corporations, the Council of American Shipbuilders considered that the pacifist influence in America had become too great, and so had hired Lee to counteract it, paying him $150,000 for his services in spreading publicity. These were only some of Lee's manifold activities, which, in his later years, included services for some foreign governments. In the systematic campaigns carried on in America by multimillionaires and corporations to modify or otherwise shape public opinion, great sums were spent. Magnates take on a new character. Meanwhile, a number of leading millionaires gave themselves a new character, that of humanitarians and philanthropists. This they did by establishing foundations. Here we go, here it comes. This is how they took over education. One of the first to enter this field was Andrew Carnegie, to whom we have had occasion to refer in a previous chapter. This leads us to say that even a compressed account of his concern, Carnegie and Company, and the wealth it brought to him, and in a lesser degree to Frick, Schwab, and others, would of itself require numerous chapters. One source of that wealth was underpaid and overworked employees, a system leading, in 1892, to a great strike at Homestead, Pennsylvania. There goes your Carnegie, the great philanthropist. He was a chiseler to his own employees, so much so that it caused strikes, and in 1892, and armed Pinkerton detectives utilized by the company provoked a slaughter upon the strikers. Here we go, there you go, false flag operations, even back in 1892. Wow. Another factor enhancing the wealth of Carnegie and Associates was a high tariff, and a third, the secret low freight rates granted by railroads. Called as a witness, Carnegie informed the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations on February 5, 1915, that, quote, "In pursuance of my decision to cease accumulation and begin distribution of my surplus wealth," unquote, he had retired from business in 1901. This, he should have added, was the time his plant was merged in the United States Steel Corporation. He related how he had given many millions in gifts and pensions to his workmen, $24 million to the Carnegie Institute of Pittsburgh, and other large sums in other directions. The Carnegie Corporation of New York had been chartered in 1911 to aid schools, libraries, scientific research, and similar purposes. Despite the huge sums which Carnegie gave for such endowments, his net estate at his death, as shown by an appraisal in 1920, was $23,247,161. John D. Rockefeller had, on May 14, 1913, incorporated the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered to promote schools. It's not promoting schools, it's taking over schools, is what both of these foundations were. Funding scientific research, funding Darwinism, that's all it was. Promoting schools, libraries, scientific research, there it is again, and assist educational institutions. Read that, take over, co-opt educational institutions. And I don't think Gustavus Myers would disagree with that. His original gift, Rockefeller's original gift to this institution, comprised securities then having a market value of $100 million. Further, he established a group of other foundations, all heavily endowed. He himself gave this explanation to the U.S. Industrial Commission, quote, "The sole motive underlying the various foundations which I have established has been the desire to devote a portion of my fortune to the service of my fellow men," unquote. Right. Oh, where's Bill Cosby to remember that Noah skit? Right. The Commission's final report presented conclusions which gave aspects different from the rather widely prevalent view which regarded the foundations as wholly grounded upon philanthropic principles. Oh boy. Read Foundations, Their Power and Influence by René Wormser. That'll tell you what the foundations were really about. For impinging upon the passing older generation, which had been shocked or outraged by the acts of big wealth seekers, a new generation, largely unfamiliar with those enormities, had come. Such men as Carnegie and Rockefeller stood out to many by reason of huge sums of money donated as colossi of benevolence and philanthropy. That was their plan. whitewashing history and their reputations. Ascribed source of the funds. The final report stated, quote, "The funds of these foundations are largely invested in securities of corporations dominant in American history. The policies of these foundations must inevitably be colored, if not controlled, to conform to the policies of such corporations. The funds of the foundation represent largely the result either of the exploitation of American workers through the payment of low wages, or the exploitation of the American public through the exaction of high prices. The power of these foundations is practically unlimited, except that they may not directly engage in business for profit. Foundations are subject to no public control, and their powers can be curbed only by the difficult process of amending or revoking their charters. The extent of the possible influence in shaping education and opinion of these foundations," wow, this is prophetic, "is shown by a large amount of evidence in the possession of the Commission." Unquote. Examples were cited of, quote, "a degree of control over the teachings of professors in our colleges and universities which constitutes a most serious menace." Unquote. There it is. What a prophetic report. Wow. And here we are today, and these foundations have completely, utterly taken over. They now own education. And they whitewash it at will. In a separate memorandum, 2 members of the Commission declared that, quote, "Many of these endowments in private hands have a beneficial effect," unquote, but they recommended a, quote, "federal fund for social welfare in order that the nation may compete with or displace private foundations in this vital matter," unquote. A survey of foundations in America made in 1931 showed 91 with capital resources then aggregating $800 million, of which $673 million was concentrated in New York City. The resources of the various Rockefeller organizations were placed at $250 million, and those of the Carnegie organizations at $237 million. In a single year, the 91 foundations had disbursed $52 million. Rockefeller wealth. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had long since turned over his securities and estates to his son of the same name. On more than one occasion in public addresses, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had depreciated the effect of great money inheritances and the value of money as judged by the much greater importance of humanitarian needs. He has been, in fact, a man of deep religious convictions and personal kindliness. Really? Think again, Gus. But the conditions surrounding him apparently left him with no alternative but to hold on to the wealth entrusted to him. The extent of the wealth held by him in oil companies alone was shown by the records of the Securities and Exchange Commission early in 1935. The law establishing this body requires statements from large holders of stocks. At the end of November 1934, John D. Rockefeller Jr. held a total of 10,181,020 shares of common stock in the Standard Oil Company of California, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, and the Saucony Vacuum Company, leading units of that industry. At that date, the market value of these stocks was in the vicinity of $245 million. His statement listed himself as the, quote, beneficial owner, unquote, of more than 10% of the stock of the three companies, and further informed the commission that he had, quote, unquote, transferred 1,592,400 of the shares, but did not specify to whom. But his cousin, Percy A. Rockefeller, could not bear money losses brought about by the Great Industrial Depression commencing in 1929, and sold stocks, quote-unquote, short, in the aim to recoup himself. This Rockefeller was a son of William Rockefeller, a brother of John D. Rockefeller Sr., and an associate in the original promotion and later rulership of the Standard Oil Company. By force of inherited wealth, he became one of America's leading industrialists and financiers. At one time, he was a director of 51 corporations. The quote-unquote short selling of stocks caused a great public scandal. Summoned as a witness by the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, investigating stock exchange practices, he defended his course. The, quote, tremendous depreciation, unquote, since 1929, he testified, had cost him a great many millions. He needed money. And, he declared, his quote-unquote short selling had netted him only $550,000, which sum, he stated, was slight compared to his, quote, tremendous losses, unquote. Oh, wow. Members of the Rockefeller family married into other plutocratic families. The narrative of these connections and of the origin of the associated great fortunes would necessitate many chapters. Where the Duke riches came from. In the years since 1933, Doris Duke has figured much in publicity as the, quote, richest girl in the world, unquote. Although this description is perhaps superlative, the wealth inherited by her is great. She is the daughter of James B. Duke, who, after giving away $40 million, left an estate appraised, at the time of his death in 1925, at more than $101 million. By the terms of the will, a third of her inheritance was to be turned over to her when she was 21, which was in 1933. She was to receive half of the remainder when she reached the age of 25, and the balance 5 years later. In 1927, her share was appraised at $53 million, but the downward course of the prices of securities during the Depression reduced the sum, for the time being at any rate. This was one of many multi-millionaire fortunes from the tobacco industry. The casual reference to Duke in an earlier chapter, and some facts there given as to the operations of the Tobacco Trust, is but a small part of a great amount of data, an appropriate account of which would fill a quarter of a volume. The Duke family, W. Duke Sons and Company, started as manufacturers of cigarette tobacco. They, with 4 other cigarette manufacturers, launched in 1890 a combination called the American Tobacco Company, with a capital of $25 million, largely of watered stock. Or, as the U.S. Commissioner of Corporations reported, quote, an amount vastly in excess of tangible assets, unquote. James B. Duke was made president of this company, which, at its inception, secured control of 60% of the cigarette business in America, making in its first years more than $4 million annually. Quote, very large average profits, unquote, reported the U.S. Commissioner of Corporations. The American Tobacco Company then extended its domination over other branches of the tobacco industry, consolidating and merging other concerns, 86 in all. The total capitalization of the American Tobacco Company was run up to $235 million. The full story of the huge profits, the issuance of large stock dividends in addition to ordinary dividends, the inflation of stock issues, the manipulation of stock, and other methods, filled 475 pages of the report of the U.S. Commissioner of Corporations in 1911. Meanwhile, then as later, as official reports showed, most of the small tobacco growers in America had the hardest time making a bare living. The sums paid to them for their product were beaten down to the scantiest of prices. Their lot was distressing. In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the dissolution of the Tobacco Trust, but, as in the case of the Standard Oil Company, its components rearranged their position and kept on flourishing. Duke perpetuates his name. Already by 1905, James B. Duke was noted as, quote, the Croesus of the tobacco trade, unquote, and rated a lofty multimillionaire. He then began the construction of a $1 million palace on an estate of 2,500 acres bought by him near Somerville, New Jersey, and on the improvement and adornment of this estate he spent more great sums, perhaps at the reported $2 million. Other multimillionaires had, by the sheer outlay of money, glorified and perpetuated themselves as philanthropists by establishing institutions bearing their names. But such institutions were new. James B. Duke went a long step further. In 1924, he set aside a $40 million fund in securities for the benefit of Trinity College at Durham, North Carolina, on condition that it change its name to Duke University. If it declined, the fund was to be used in creating a new institution. The offer was not declined, and in recent years Duke's money has been used to erect a great group of new buildings at Duke University. There was wide and severe criticism of Duke's action, but it passed away. And in 1934, the dean of Duke University Medical School was able, without contradiction, to laud James B. Duke as a great philanthropist whose aim was to uplift mankind. Benjamin N. Duke, a brother, died in 1929, leaving a multi-millionaire fortune. Okay, we're going to take a break and see you on the other side of this song. All right, we're back. Time for the finishing up of the book, really. We're on the last part of the epilogue to The Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers from 1910. Quote, become wealthy because thrifty, unquote. The instances given in this epilogue, following the amplification in the chapters, are but a few of a large number showing the actual processes by which great fortunes have been amassed. Yet when Daniel Guggenheim was questioned by Chairman Frank P. Walsh at a hearing of the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations on January 21, 1915, as to wealth possessors, he thus explained the source of their wealth. Quote, "These men and women have become wealthy because they have been thrifty. In America, I think we can assume that the most of those who have become wealthy in the last 10 or 15 years have been thrifty." Unquote. This was gravely told to a commission, the members of which were exceedingly well informed on a multitude of recent reports of investigating committees disclosing the realistic facts. And in a rather similar way, Julius Rosenwald, head of Sears Roebuck and Company, declared in an interview in 1930 that 95% of the great fortunes were, quote, due to luck, unquote. Rosenwald's estate was estimated at $50 million. Apart from their profit in ordinary times, the profits of all kinds of corporations in war and post-war times were extraordinary. And as a businessman, Rosenwald thoroughly knew, of course, that fortunes were based upon profit, and that many a fortune had been further vastly swollen by flagrant profiteering. Only a few years before Rosenwald uttered his dictum, the Federal Trade Commission had, in a series of reports, exposed wartime profits, and this information, widely published in the newspapers, was a matter of common knowledge. The average rates of net income on investment of 4 of the most important successor companies of the old American Tobacco Company ranged from 1916 to 1920 from 12.5% to more than 21%, and these high returns were kept up, quote unquote, in spite, stated the Federal Trade Commission, quote, of extensive declines in leaf tobacco prices, unquote. Similar outrageous profiteering by corporations dealing in anthracite coal, lumber, meat products, steel, and various other commodities was specifically reported by the Federal Trade Commission. Guggenheim solidarity. Some of the Guggenheim and Rosenwald wealth was used to endow foundations named after them. The narrative of how the great aggregate wealth of the Guggenheims was amassed would require a series of chapters. Briefly, a few facts may be here mentioned. The founder was Meyer Guggenheim, who had come to America as an immigrant. Successively, he made and vended stove polish and manufactured embroideries. As they grew up, all of his 7 sons became associated with him in the smelting business in which he later embarked. In its unity of purpose and solidarity of interests, the Guggenheim family resembled the Rothschilds. In 1899, they organized the American Smelting and Refining Company, which acquired gold, silver, copper, lead, nickel, and other mines and smelting plants in the United States and elsewhere, chiefly Mexico. They rapidly became multimillionaires, and in 1907, Simon Guggenheim was elected a United States Senator from Colorado. Facts brought out before the Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives show the profits of the American Smelting and Refining Company to have been $8 million in 1905, $10 million in 1906, and $7 million in 1907. Charges were made in 1910 by United States Senator Bristow that in Congress tariff rates on lead had been manipulated in favor of the Smelter Trust. The individual Guggenheims, as testimony before the U.S. Commissions on Industrial Relations in 1915 showed, had extended their financial interests to include a great variety of industrial, transportation, and other corporations. In 1930, announcement was made of the consolidation of a $375 million company of all of the vast nitrate deposits in Chile, the government of which owns 65% and the Guggenheim interests the remainder. In this company, both the Chilean government and Guggenheim holdings were included. As for the American Smelting and Refining Company, at this writing Simon Guggenheim is its head, it is rated as the largest corporation of its nature in the world. And it has a group of 21 subsidiary companies. These are but a few items, not omitting patent matters and litigation, indicating the development of the Guggenheim's fortunes. Ascent of the Mellons. A few years ago, the Wall Street Journal classed Andrew W. Mellon as one of the 4 richest Americans. In the decades when the Rockefeller and other great fortunes were being heaped together, and great publicity was devoted to them and their acts, hardly any attention was given, at least outside Pittsburgh, to the Mellon family. In Wall Street, financial books dealing with capitalists 30 years ago, not a mention was to be found of the Mellons. Here again, an adequate narrative of the elaboration of means by which the Mellon wealth was acquired would fill many, many chapters. It would begin with the establishment by Judge Thomas Mellon of a private bank, T. Mellon and Sons, in Pittsburgh. In this bank, Judge Mellon clustered a variety of interests and left his fortune to his 3 sons, Andrew W., Richard B., and James Ross. Soon after the year 1900, Andrew W. Mellon formed the Mellon National Bank. He himself recently told some of the story of his rapid ascent to great wealth. This occurred at a hearing in Pittsburgh before the Board of Tax Appeals in 1935. One of the Pittsburgh banks in which he had become a director was the Fidelity Trust Company. This organized the Union Trust Company to do a, quote, reciprocal business, unquote, and Andrew W. Mellon was made its president. From an original capital of $100,000, the Union Trust Company expanded until it became a $300 million institution. Such was the outline given by Mellon, but the ways in which this aggrandizement was accomplished were not detailed, and the analysis of them would make a long account. At the same hearing, facts were produced giving another instance of how expeditiously the Mellons amassed wealth and ever a stream of more wealth. Andrew W. and Richard B. Mellon had launched the huge Aluminum Company of America, called the Aluminum Trust. Here we go with these are the guys who gave you the fluoride in the water, folks. These are one of them. The nuclear industry is the other one. The transactions, operations, and profits of which would alone cover several chapters. 2 engineers, McClintock and Marshall, recently graduated from Lehigh University, presented the plan of a steel fabricating plant at Pottstown, Pennsylvania. The 2 Mellon brothers each agreed to invest $75,000 keeping in return 60% of the stock of the McClintock Marshall Construction Company, capitalized at $250,000. So much money did this company make, and so fast, that in 13 years its profits enabled it to increase its plant capacity 6 times. It acquired a string of subsidiary corporations which it owned partly or wholly. By 1930 it had assets of $64 million. And during a series of years, it paid its 4 stockholders upwards of $8 million in dividends prior to its purchase in 1931 by the Bethlehem Steel Company. The Mellons' share of the purchase price was $12,600,000. On an investment of $150,000 they had made, so the figures as reported evidenced, more than $17 million. But these details were merest fragments of the whole story of the vast network of banks and corporations of many kinds from which great revenues flowed into the Mellon strongboxes. The Aluminum Cooking Utensil Company, the Aluminum Seal Company, the Gulf Oil Corporation, and other oil-producing and refining companies, coal and coke, water, electric power, and other companies, these were in the extensive list. Andrew W. Mellon became ambassador to Great Britain and served as Secretary of the Treasury under Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. It was after a different political administration, that of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, came in power that the Bureau of Internal Revenue charged a deficiency of $3 million in Andrew W. Mellon's income tax return for 1931, and the hearing above referred to was an appeal from that finding. At this hearing, his own financial secretary, on February 25, 1935, testified as follows, that in his income tax return, this former Secretary of the Treasury had ignored a rule which was promulgated during his tenure of office and which he himself had approved in 1929, a rule requiring taxpayers to report holding of tax-exempt securities. That in 1932, Andrew W. Mellon, on the expressed ground that he wished to divest himself of business cares and devote himself more thoroughly to, quote, philanthropic matters in which I am particularly interested, unquote, had turned over millions of dollars in securities to his 2 children, but he had indirectly retained control over those securities. The data, as produced by Andrew W. Mellon's financial secretary, was specific as well as highly complicated, but out of it all seemed to protrude the fact that there was no time at which Mellon did not ingeniously safeguard his cash interests. I read that wrong, by the way. That was his tax returns, plural. That was not one. That was more than one. R.B. Mellon died. At this writing, no decision by the Board of Tax Appeals has been made. R.B. Mellon died in 1933, leaving an estate which, in a document filed by appraisers with the Register of Wills in Pittsburgh in May 1935, was valued at $21,615,000, not including real estate. Almost all of that sum was represented by stocks. A few years previously, his wealth had been estimated at a much greater amount, but the slump in stock prices had doubtless affected it. Touching upon the DuPonts. However abbreviated, a competent description of the origin and expansion of the DuPont fortune would entail chapter after chapter. It would have to begin more than a century and a quarter ago, when a DuPont established the first small gunpowder plant in Delaware, and give the history up to the present of E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, leading manufacturers of explosives. Along the dominating financial power in Delaware, the DuPonts sequentially developed political power. After 2 decades of leadership in the Republican organization of that state, T. Coleman DuPont was elected United States Senator in 1921. He was of the Kentucky branch of the DuPont family, and in 1902 had been made head of the DuPont plants after the death of Eugene DuPont. T. Coleman DuPont died in 1930. From 1916 to that date, he had made gifts of more than $10 million, mainly to members of his family, and he left an estate appraised in 1933 at $17,520,642, an estate which, of course, had been larger during the times when stock prices were high. World War profits. From the World War's start, that would be World War I, American manufacturers of munitions made huge profits, of course. The startling facts regarding these were brought out in 1934 by a special committee of the United States Senate investigating the munitions industry. According to the committee's findings, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company took in a gross of $1,245,000,000 for supplying material to warring governments, including the American, between 1915 and 1918, inclusive, and during that period paid dividends of 458% on a par value of its stock. Further, that a large part of these profits were so arranged as to be used as funds for a great expansion of the company's activities in the peace years following. As high as 80% of profits, the DuPonts asserted in reply, went to pay excess profit taxes. Their clear profit from war sales was, however, extremely large. This was convincingly shown by the opulent dividends distributed by the DuPont Company. On the common stock, a regular dividend of $1.50 and an extra dividend of $28.50 in 1915. A regular dividend of $6 and an extra dividend of $94 in 1916. A regular dividend of $18 and an extra dividend of $33 in 1917. A regular dividend of $18 and an extra dividend of $3 in 1918. 6 of the DuPont family were listed as in the class of multimillionaires, each having, in war and post-war years, a yearly income of $1 million or more. The list also included, it may be here noted, the names of J. Pierpont Morgan, James B. Duke, Arthur W. Mellon, Arthur Curtis James, George F. Baker, Henry Ford, and sundry others, 181 individuals in all. Abundant funds to expand. The seizure of German patents by the United States government in 1917, after America's entry into the war, opened the wide way to the DuPonts embarking in the dyestuffs industry. Their scope was enlarged to include the making of rayon, paints, lacquers, varnishes, cellophane, ammonia, acids, chemicals of various kinds, and other products. the capitalization of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company was expanded to $450 million, of which the greater part in 1936 was outstanding stock. The company's net income in 1935 was a shade more than $62 million. The control of this company, as shown by returns to the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1936, was vested in 9 of the DuPonts, 8 of whom were directors, and 5 heavy stockholders. Obviously, with their enormous revenues ever piling up, the DuPonts were in an opportune position to extend their holdings, and by the sovereign impact of their cash, make themselves overlords in other industrial fields. In the diversity of their investments, a foremost possession is their great ownership of stock in the General Motors Corporation automobile manufacturers. A report of the Securities and Exchange Commission on July 16, 1936, showed the enormous DuPont holdings. Indirectly, through the General Motors Securities Company, the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company owned 9,843,750 shares, which at stock market prices had a value of about $690 million. At the same time, the DuPont Company was the, quote, beneficial owner, unquote, of 156,250 shares, and 4 of the DuPonts were directors of the General Motors Corporation, with a direct total ownership of 222,615 shares. One big fact about Henry Ford. But we cannot suffer this epilogue to run on interminably. The temptation is strong to include a sketch of Henry Ford's career, but even this would be of great length. One outstanding fact will merely be noted. What has been the result to the Ford Motor Company of 33 years of manufacturing? On this point we have the statement of his own spokesman, William J. Cameron. In a radio address on June 14, 1936, Cameron declared that the Ford Motor Company in that period had made 24,500,000 automobiles, the profit on which was $782,016,144, or an average of $20 a car. The purport of Cameron's statement, thus put forward in behalf of the Ford Motor Company, was to show that the profits of the company were by no means as great as commonly supposed. He figured out the $782,016,144 as profits after deducting taxes and other commitments. He admitted that, quote, it looks like a lot of money, unquote, but he explained that much of it had gone into company plants. He might have added that whether the profits were distributed or partly used to enlarge plants, the result was the further enrichment of the Fords. The financial results of years vary, but we have some criterion of the great income of the Fords personally from the federal income tax they paid in 1925. In an earlier chapter, we have explained that this was the only year in which federal income tax payments were made public, and we gave the sums paid by Henry Ford and his son Edsel Ford. In that year they, with one exception, headed the list of the 25 largest income tax payers in America. Henry Ford paid $2,608,806, and Edsel Ford $2,158,055 federal income tax. Instancing Woolworth. And Much as the necessity presses to bring this matter to a close, we have to mention at least one of the large fortunes derived from 5 and 10 cent chain stores. From his multitude of chain stores, F.W. Woolworth derived a fortune estimated at $35 million at his death in 1919. So fast did profits roll in that in 1926 a stock dividend of 50% was declared. When his widow died in 1924, her estate, valued at $55,416,721 net, was bequeathed equally to her 2 daughters, Helena W. McCann and Mrs. Jessie W. Donahue, and a granddaughter, Barbara Hutton. Woolworth's 2 daughters in 1936 were the 2 largest stockholders of the F.W. Woolworth Company common stock. Mrs. McCann owned 565,006 shares, and Mrs. Donahue 609,250 shares. 20.5% profit and wage reductions. A few years ago, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, the F.W. Woolworth Company published a glowing eulogy of the founder and an exaltation of the company's progress. The reverse side was brought out in Congress, where complaints were made of the sales girls in the establishment having to work for a wage of $11 a week. Also, on December 11th, 1934, there was disclosed at Ottawa the same situation by the Canadian Parliamentary Commission, investigating mass buying and chain stores. Leslie G. Harrington, manager for Canada of the F.W. Woolworth Company, admitted that while making profits of 20.5%, the company, in 1932 and 1933, had reduced the wages of its employees 10%. The average weekly wage, he stated, for full-time saleswomen in Woolworth stores in Canada was $10.80, and some were getting as little as $7. Questioned by the Commission's counsel as to what was the justification for the company's making this wage cut when it was drawing such handsome profits, Harrington gave the reason. The wage reduction, he explained, was demanded by the New York office because a similar cut was being made in the United States. And so, having a roster of more multimillionaires in reserve, we call a halt to this edifying history, the facts in which impart their own moral and conclusion. That's it, folks. Thank you for listening to the 1910 book called The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. I'm Gordon Comstock. This is the Ministry of Truth.